Welcome, intrepid civic scholars. Here is a crash course on the founders to support you in writing your VFW essay, Is This the Country the Founders Envisioned?, which, as you know, comprises 10% of your first semester grade. Our audience, veterans of foreign wars and their spouses at the local VFW post in Port Hadlock, will be judging the best 8 essays. The prompt is inviting you to express personal views, but of course we're in this class, and at all times we are scholars, intrepid political scientists engaged in a fearless search for truth, as described in Civics Lesson 3. As I mentioned in class, most essays that win at the regional, state, and national levels contain a shout-out to the armed forces and veterans. That is, if you can do it smoothly, if you can connect it to your theme. If it's like, awkwardly grafted on there and it doesn't really make sense, don't do it. There have been winning essays that don't include that shout-out, but it strengthens your essay if you can work it in. Also, you don't want your essay to be too political. The veterans of foreign wars lean conservative, and you can, if you're interested in appealing to that audience, you can take note of that. You certainly want to avoid alienating that audience, and if you don't care about competing, at the VFW level, and you're just trying to get a grade in this class, you can write whatever you'd like, and all perspectives are always welcome in this class as long as they are grounded in evidence. So, who were the founders? Well, simply speaking, the founders, the founding fathers, were the people who started our country, the United States. But there's a few different levels of that. First, by the founders, we often mean leaders of colonial resistance to Britain from 1763 to 83. Now, let's unpack what colonial resistance to Britain means. First, what's Britain? Well, here's the continent of Europe. These are the British Isles. And the big island is Britain. The smaller island is Ireland. So that's physical geography. So political geography, where the country of Britain comes from, is, well, it started with the country of England, and then the English conquered the Welsh here in Wales, and they conquered the Scots up here in Scotland, and they conquered the Irish over here in Ireland. And so the country that becomes Britain is really dominated by the English, who outnumbered all of those Celtic people that they conquered that I just mentioned. Eventually, they dealt in the Scots as sort of semi-equal partners, but numerically, economically, culturally, the English still dominated, which is why all those areas still speak English, and it's why the United States ends up speaking English. So that's what Britain is. What are colonies? Well, colonies are, overseas extensions of Britain, right? British people came over to North America and other parts of the world too, and they invaded and conquered and settled. And so everything red on this map was part of the British Empire around 1750. When we talk about the 13 colonies, though, we're just talking about the parts that became part of the United States here on the east coast of what is now the United States, right? This is where the 13 colonies were. There were British colonies elsewhere in North America, but they did not end up joining the United States. So the land, of course, originally belonged to the Native Americans. Most of the native population was wiped out by European plagues even before the British got there. And the relatively small population of Indians who remained found it difficult to resist the invasion because the British invaders had a technological advantage too, with steel weapons and firearms. Bad deal for the Indians. And sometimes people have the wrong idea about why British folks left the relative safety of Britain and came to settle in colonies in the Americas. The stone cold truth is that most people came for money. There was very little economic opportunity back in Britain. Most of the land was owned by a few rich royals and nobles, and there wasn't a lot of opportunity for regular folks. And so if you had enough money to get across the Atlantic, you could, get to North America, and there was a lot of land available, right? Because there was a lot of land and not that many people. Indians had been driven off by military force, and it was possible for a regular person to get some land and have a farm and make a life for themselves. Rags to respectability. Rags to riches, historically very uncommon, but you could go from, if you could scratch up enough money to get across the ocean, you could get a decent life for yourself here in the Americas. And even if you didn't have enough money to get over, there was a way. A lot of poor folks in Britain sold themselves into temporary slavery called indentured servitude. That got them free passage across the Atlantic, but then they had to work off usually a 7-year contract where they worked without pay. And if they survived till the end of that, then they were turned free and they had an opportunity to claim some land and have their own farm. Imagine how desperate you'd have to be to sell yourself into slavery for a period of 7 years to get across the ocean and go into a new land. Some folks came to America because another source of indentured servants. Sometimes people would get arrested and convicted, and the judge would give them a choice. It's like, you can either rot in prison here in England, or you could be an indentured servant, and we'll send you to North America. And prisons back then were even worse than they are now, much, much worse than they are now. So a lot of folks were indentured servitude in North America, thank you. Now, the myth is that a bunch of people came to British North America, to the 13 colonies, for religious freedom. And, that was, some people did. Some people came for religious reasons, but as I mentioned before, most people were coming for money or for legal reasons. The folks who were coming for religious reasons weren't all coming for religious freedom. I mean, often the Pilgrims and the Puritans are misrepresented as people who were coming for religious freedom. No, they were coming to take away religious freedom. They were disturbed by the amount of religious freedom in Britain, in the British Isles, and they wanted to come and start colonies, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire, where they could force everyone to be Puritan like them and toe the line. So, in the 1600s, Massachusetts and Connecticut and New Hampshire were less religiously free than Britain, though later on they loosened up by the 1700s. Now, New England is just, these northern colonies up here. In the middle colonies and in the southern colonies, you had a different story. You actually had true religious freedom in a couple colonies. De jure means legal, right? So under the law in Rhode Island and Pennsylvania, people had religious freedom, right? They could choose how to worship. In the rest of the colonies, there were established churches. An established church is a government-sponsored church. So everybody, paid taxes, and some of those taxes were given to the colonial government's favorite church. But there was a perpetual shortage of priests and ministers, a shortage of churches, so those taxes weren't high, and those churches actually didn't serve that many people. Most folks in the 13 colonies actually lived outside the reach of organized religion, and they either just remained unchurched and didn't go to church, though often they were nominally Christian at least. And in some cases, people, out in the backcountry, they'd set up their own church. And sometimes that was, aping the established church, and sometimes that was a different kind of church. So this word de facto, means, there was no law saying there was religious freedom in these other colonies, But since most people lived outside the reach of the established churches, there was effective religious freedom. In reality, they were experiencing the analog of religious freedom due to the shortage of churches and priests and ministers. So yeah, a colony is an overseas territory, right? And so there are 13, well, there's actually more than 13 colonies in North America, but the 13 colonies on the east coast of what are now the United States are the ones that become the United States. So let's check out why they ended up resisting Britain. The screenshots at right are from the epic Schoolhouse Rock cartoon talking about the shot heard round the world and why the colonists needed to get out, needed to resist Britain. Now, first of all, it's important to understand that the colonies belonged to Britain, right? And when people moved from the British Isles to the 13 colonies of British North America, they were still staying in the same country, right? It'd be like if you moved to Alaska, you wouldn't think you were leaving the United States because you know that Alaska is part of the United States, right? You'd still be an American in Alaska, just as you're an American here in Washington. Well, the same logic applied there. They knew they were not leaving British jurisdiction. The folks who lived in the 13 colonies, the mystery here is why the British people who lived in the 13 colonies thought that they needed to separate from the mother country, thought they needed to fight and throw off British rule. Now, the grade school version, which like most adult Americans continue to carry in their head because history is probably the worst taught subject in most schools and has been going back a century at least. The grade school version of this is that Americans fought they fought monarchy, right? They didn't want to have a king, and the British were putting high taxes on them. And the Americans just wanted democracy. They wanted government by the people, and they wanted to be free and separate from Britain. Right? That's the grade school version, and most of that is wrong or oversimplified. As I just mentioned, the colonists didn't think of themselves as Americans yet. They thought of themselves as British, as subjects of the British crown. And to the extent that they had a separate identity. A slightly different identity. It was a local identity. They thought of themselves as Virginians or Pennsylvanians or whatever you call someone from Massachusetts. And also, they were okay, actually, with the king, right? Because the British king wasn't like other kings in Europe. Other kings in Europe ruled with an iron fist and sort of controlled everything. But the British had put their king in check a long time ago. The role of the king in the British government was close to the role of the president in our government. And just as in our government, the president is in charge of some things but doesn't run the whole country, right? The laws all get passed by Congress. Well, the British had the same setup, right? Our government system mirrors the British government setup. In Britain, instead of Congress, they call it Parliament, right? Parliament, the elected representatives of the British people. And Parliament made laws. And the colonists, when they would complain about British laws, they would focus their ire on Parliament. They'd actually tend to let the king off the hook. They're like, oh, the king's a good guy. It's those dirty politicians in Parliament. Which, again, we still kind of do, right? Americans are, historically have liked the president, and when things go wrong, they tend to blame those dirty politicians in Congress. So, and then like the high tax thing, the British actually never passed high taxes on the 13 colonies. Notice this is my abbreviation for 13 colonies. They did ask the 13 colonies to pay taxes, and we're going to see they said no, but it's important to understand those weren't high taxes. And the 13 colonies were already democratic. They practiced democracy at the local level. The British government, the national government, was sort of democratic too. So it's not like you have to leave Britain to be democratic, because it was the English, the British, who invented democracy. I mentioned before that their identity is as British people. I will talk in a minute about divisions.